Recently, there was a lawsuit against Yuzu, an emulator for the Nintendo Switch, and it was recently settled for $2.4 million. And I would like to give some of my thoughts regarding the situation. Keep in mind, however, that I am not a lawyer, and I am mostly focusing on what I think should be right, not what is necessarily legally right. My personal stance is that Switch piracy is wrong, and that you should buy your Switch games. But Switch emulation is awesome, and no, these are not contradictory. But anyways, firstly, I want to look at Nintendo's definition of an emulator, which is not only disingenuous in my opinion, but also a bit hypocritical. But before we take a look at that, it is important to understand that emulation in and of itself is legal, and there are many cases that help to establish that. One of the main ones being Sony vs. Connectix, which you can take a look at your own time. Getting back to Nintendo, they state that a video game emulator is a piece of software that allows users to unlawfully play pirated video games that were published only for a specific console on a general purpose computing device. While this is technically true, that is not the intention of most emulators, and most emulators will explicitly tell you to not pirate and to dump your own games. Let's take Dolphin, for example. In its FAQ, it has the question, where can I download game ISOs/ROMs? It then answers it by saying, you don't. Buy games and dump them with a Wii. Now, of course, there are many people who choose to disobey this and pirate anyway, but that isn't the fault nor the intention of the emulator developers. It is important to realize that you can emulate without pirating. Funny, because this logic would also apply to Nintendo. I mean, yeah, Nintendo puts in DRM and says not to hack their consoles, but it also happens anyway against their wishes. But if we want to use Nintendo's logic, then instead of the hackers, Nintendo is to blame for this, and therefore they are also to blame for piracy as well. If we're going to blame emulators for making it, quote, easier to pirate, shouldn't we also blame Nintendo for making an easy to hack console? If something being misused or having negative side effects was reason enough to shut something down, many things that we enjoy would be gone. An example I used before was PC piracy, which often runs on Windows PCs. If we were to apply this logic, we would have to shut down Windows because of its capability to run pirated software. Obviously this is dumb and wouldn't make sense because it wouldn't be worth shutting down all the benefits that Windows brings and punishing them because of a negative side effect that they didn't even cause. And I believe that also applies to emulators as well, and we will go over all the benefits of emulation later in the video. The issue of breaking DRM is an issue that we will discuss later, but as far as the piracy argument, I just don't see how emulators are at fault. Secondly, Nintendo uses emulation themselves. Nintendo Switch Online literally comes with emulators for the NES, SNES, Game Boy, Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, and you can literally find job offers to work as an emulation engineer for Nintendo. Even before that, Nintendo used emulation with the Virtual Console for the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS, as well as released an NES mini console which is literally just emulation. If Nintendo was so against emulation and really thought it was piracy, why would they do it themselves? And I get that Nintendo was emulating their own games for the most part, but they've also had non-Nintendo games being emulated, such as the games from the Sega Mega Drive, Master System, and Game Gear. Speaking of Sega, their approach to emulation is far more better than Nintendo's, which means that Nintendo really doesn't need to act in the way that they do, but we will get to that later. The point is that even though Nintendo wants to make this about piracy, it's really not the issue, at least in this case. The real issue is the breaking of DRM and Nintendo losing control over consumers. If emulators aren't the cause of piracy, then what is? Even if emulators aren't directly causing piracy, people are still using them to play pirated ROMs. So where do all these ROMs come from? To further explain this, I would like to make a little timeline. It all began when the Nintendo Switch got hacked. When Nintendo released the Switch, they also released one of, if not the most hackable console of all time, and by early 2018, the Switch had already been hacked. To explain how this works, I would encourage watching How the Nintendo Switch Security Was Defeated by Modern Vintage Gamer on YouTube. In short, by going into RCM mode, you can use an exploit found within the boot ROM to load unsigned code. This exploit is also unpatchable without changing the hardware, meaning that all, quote, V1 switches that were released before the patch was made are hackable with no fix. With this came the start of the Switch homebrew scene, which means things like custom firmware, Android, Linux, game ports, emulators, overclocking, etc. But the main things that we are focused on is the dumping of switch files such as the prod.keys file, which is needed to decrypt switch ROMs, and switch ROMs, which are normally encrypted, both of which are needed to use emulators such as Yuzu, and also constitutes as, quote, breaking DRM, which is what Nintendo is mainly concerned about. Now we were able to get DRM-free copies of ROMs as files, which you can now store on our computers and use in emulators such as Yuzu or on our hacked Switches. So far, we still haven't committed piracy yet, so keep that in mind. The piracy element comes when we take those files and then redistribute them, such as on a ROM site where people can come and download them. That is where piracy comes in. So how does this tie in with Yuzu? As I stated previously, Yuzu needs the prod.keys file and Switch ROMs in order to work. You are intended to dump these files from your own Switch and your own games, but you can also pirate these files from online and use Yuzu that way. As downloading Yuzu from the internet is easier than going out and buying a hackable Switch, many people have misused Yuzu in order to pirate Switch games. As I have stated earlier, however, this is a misuse of the emulator. Yuzu didn't cause the Switch to be hacked, Yuzu didn't create the tools to break DRM and backup Switch files, and Yuzu didn't redistribute those files to the internet. Someone else did. And again, the same thing would also apply to a hacked Switch. Nintendo didn't do those things either, but they still happened. What Yuzu did do, however, was have a guide on how to break Nintendo's DRM, which definitely didn't help their case. But now we get to what Nintendo's argument really is. But before we get there, we need to discuss the law on DRM and the gray area of emulation. Basically, we have two conflicting laws, both of which can be interpreted in different ways. So if my interpretation here is incorrect or you disagree with it, feel free to let me know. First, we have the law on backups. According to copyright law, you are allowed to make a copy of software for backup purposes, provided you legally own the work and that the copy is destroyed if you ever lose ownership of the original work by selling it or giving it away. I interpret this law as you are allowed to make backups for the software that you own, which in this case would mean Switch ROMs. Now there could be other interpretations, but that is how I interpret it, and I think it's a pretty fair interpretation. Now let's look at the second part of the equation, which is DRM and DMCA. DRM stands for Digital Rights Management, and it can come in many different forms, but they all are trying to accomplish the same thing, which is to control how users can access copyrighted content, usually by preventing or making it difficult to make copies. This often has a lot of negative side effects that we will discuss later. DMCA is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which makes it illegal to try and circumvent or bypass DRM. And now you can see where the contradiction takes place, since Nintendo has DRM on their Switch games. Basically, I am allowed to have a backup of my Switch game, but in order to get a backup, I will need to break DRM, which is illegal. And this is why this area of law is considered a gray area, and unless it is tested in court, will probably remain that way unless there is a change. Understanding this, however, we can now look at Nintendo's argument. The thing is, whether you dumped your own Switch files or downloaded them from the internet, both are technically illegal. One is breaking DRM, and the other is piracy, and Nintendo groups both of these cases together under the umbrella of, quote, illegal copies. Which, again, isn't technically wrong, but also conflates breaking DRM with piracy, which I feel is a bit disingenuous. And in order for Yuzu to work, it needs an illegal copy of either the prod.keys file or Switch games. Without them, Yuzu technically is legal, but it's also useless, and it puts the burden of breaking the law on the user. In Nintendo's words, quote, without Yuzu's decryption of Nintendo's encryption, unauthorized copies of games could not be played on PCs or Android devices, end quote. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if this alone would be pretty damning because again, Yuzu technically isn't providing any of these illegal files, but it does require them to work. But Nintendo doesn't just stop there. It also points out that Yuzu had a guide on their website on how to get the prod.keys file, and also how to dump your own games. This one is pretty damning, as Yuzu basically has instructions on how to break the law, which I imagine would be pretty difficult to defend. While again, this wouldn't be the same as telling people how to pirate, it is telling people how to break DRM, which would be illegal. Now there are other things Nintendo brings up, such as the fact that Yuzu makes money from their Patreon, and also some of their games being leaked before official release. But I don't think these extra points are that meaningful. Yeah, Yuzu makes money from donations, but that is nowhere near the amount they could be making if their emulator was closed sourced and cost money. I guess they were trying to pitch Yuzu as trying to profit off of piracy, but I think that's a bit of a stretch, especially when we have seen what companies like Team Executor have done, who were actually just trying to make money. But I guess technically Yuzu did profit from the emulator to some degree because they had early access features when you supported them on Patreon. And again, Yuzu isn't responsible for games being leaked. The reason games get leaked is because someone in the supply chain got an early copy and used their hacked Switch to dump the game and distribute it online. And since Yuzu is open source, other people can work on it to make those games playable outside of the control of the main team. In addition, even without Yuzu, those leaked games would still be playable on a hacked Switch, so Yuzu really isn't at fault here. So why did Yuzu settle? So now that we have a better understanding of the case, or at least how I was able to understand the case, why did Yuzu settle? I'm not a lawyer, but I think that if Yuzu went to court, they probably had a chance of winning against the claims Nintendo gave. Yes, they do have a guide on how to break Nintendo's DRM, but that's about it, and Nintendo is suing them for a lot more than just that. They are suing them for piracy, which I just don't see how they are responsible for. But here's the thing, no matter the outcome here, Nintendo wins. How? Well, lawsuits cost money. Money that Nintendo has plenty of, but Yuzu probably doesn't. So if they did go to court, even if Yuzu did win, they would likely have to shut it down anyways because they wouldn't be able to afford to keep going. I mean, just look at what happened to Connectix. They had to shut down even though they won. It's like the saying of they won the battle but lost the war. As much as I would like David to take a stand and fight Goliath, it just isn't realistic. While Yuzu does have a Patreon, it doesn't make tons of money, and while I don't know how well off the developers of Yuzu are, I doubt they would be able to beat Nintendo in a financial battle. And so settling was most likely in their best interest to protect themselves financially. Plus, going to court would be a big risk, as any decision reached would be massive for Emulation going forward, and it's a risk they probably didn't want to take. Settling leaves only them taking the bullet, and not all of Emulation. This is the reason that when Nintendo hands out a cease and desist, most people comply, even if they might be legally right. Lawsuits just cost too much money for the average person. So what will the effects of this settlement be? Unfortunately, as a result of this settlement, both Yuzu and Citra, a 3DS emulator, were discontinued. If you're wondering why Citra got dragged in, it's because the Yuzu developers also developed Citra as well. But also unfortunately for Nintendo, both Yuzu and Citra were open source, and even if they won't be officially available, they will always be unofficially available, and if any developers want to continue working on these projects, they can. In addition, there is another Switch emulator called Ryujinx, which is just about as good as Yuzu, which, for the time being, has not been targeted, although there is some fear that it might be next on the list. But I think the biggest L for Nintendo is that this won't even stop Switch piracy. As I have mentioned before, Yuzu was never responsible for Switch piracy, and that isn't going to change with them being gone. I mentioned V1 Switches, but since then there have been mod chips developed for the Switch, and even a Switch flash cart which is currently on the way. And because the exploit for the Switch is unpatchable, Switch piracy will continue to go on no matter how many emulators you bring down. The ROM sites are still up. The only difference is now I have to get a hack Switch to play them instead of using an emulator, but it's still doable, and it's not like hack Switches are difficult to get. But now that we have talked about the illegal aspect of this case, let's talk about the moral/ethical side of this case. As I stated in the beginning of the video, I think that Switch piracy is wrong, and you should buy your Switch games. They are still being officially sold, and with Homebrew, you can make your own DRM-free backups and actually own your Switch games, so there isn't a legit reason in my view to pirate them, even though Nintendo is trying to take that away for some reason. We have discussed piracy as a whole in another video, but to give a summary of my position, I think that piracy wouldn't be needed in a perfect world, but unfortunately, we don't have a perfect world, and due to many bad decisions by companies, piracy is needed for many different reasons. And honestly, if companies actually address these different reasons, such as, I don't know, deleting an entire digital shop, piracy wouldn't be as big of a problem as it is, but that's just me. Again, please watch that video if you haven't already. Another thing that people bring up is that there is no reason to emulate Switch games, so I'd like to clear that up right now. One of the biggest reasons to emulate Switch games is to be able to play your games without needing a Switch. Homebrew provides a way to back up your Switch games forever, but an emulator allows you to play your Switch games forever. While that might not be a problem right now, it will be an issue later, and it's reason enough for it to exist, especially with Nintendo's track record of deleting digital shops and not supporting their consoles. Secondly, emulation allows you freedom that you wouldn't have with just a Switch. I can now play my games on my PC or my phone, and not have to bring my Switch everywhere in order to play my games. In addition, emulators provide features that original hardware can't, such as higher frame rates and higher resolutions, making the experience a lot better than original hardware. Moving on to DRM, I believe that if I purchase something, I should have the right and freedom to do whatever I want with it. To me, that's what ownership means, and when that is taken away, I don't fully own what I paid for. This, however, is what Nintendo thinks. Quote, "In their ordinary course of operation, the technological measures require the application of information and processes, with the authority of Nintendo, to gain access to Nintendo's or its licensees' copyrighted works, and thus effectively control access to those works and protect the rights of the copyright owners of those works." End quote. Basically, what Nintendo is saying here is that actually, no, you shouldn't have the freedom to do whatever you want with the $300 device and $60 game you purchased. Instead, we're only letting you use the device in-game if we authorize it. Even if you paid all that money for those things, if we don't authorize it for you, you don't get to play. And we've actually seen this happen with banned Switches. If you have purchased your games digitally and your Switch gets banned, you will lose all access to the content that you paid for. If you think that's okay, I don't know what to tell you, but I don't. If you expect me to pay all that money just to not actually be able to own my games, then you can't really complain if people choose to pirate, at least in my opinion. All DRM does is make the experience for legit paying customers worse, while also making piracy look more and more appealing. You can't have your cake and eat it too. I know we are moving towards a world where we don't own anything, but I'm not and never will be okay with that. At least with homebrew, these issues can be resolved, which leads to my next point. Nintendo, why are you going after emulation and people making backups? Yes, making backups is breaking DRM and is illegal, but they aren't negatively affecting you directly like piracy does. If you take away people's ability to make backups and emulate, what do you think they're gonna do? Just sit down and take it? No, you're just giving people more reasons to pirate. And the more you try and fight piracy, the more you're actually increasing the demand to pirate, because you end up affecting people that weren't even pirating in the first place. Why do you think the catchphrase, "pirating Nintendo games is morally correct," exists? The fact is, you messed up when you release a Switch. Own it. If you want to go after piracy sites, I don't have a problem with that. But when you start going after the homebrew community and the emulation community, you're hurting people who have never pirated in the first place. Now those people have an incentive to pirate. Nintendo wants to spit in the community's face, but they get mad when the community spits back. And this has been the problem with Nintendo for years, and why I don't like them as a company, and why I don't feel sympathy when their games get pirated. This isn't just limited to this situation. Nintendo has done this for fan games, tournaments, custom accessories, etc. They literally have a reputation for sending cease and desists. And this ties into my next point, which is community. Nintendo has proven time and time again that they value their profits and IP over their community and fans. The amount of work and time the community has put into making Nintendo consoles and games better to play and experience has been incredible. And the best part is that most, if not all of these things and tools are free and done out of love. Take emulators for example. Most of them are either open source or free, with very few costing money. Take a look at the homebrew scene, which has brought emulators to consoles, ported games over, made it possible to backup games, use different operating systems, make ROM hacks, add custom servers, and so much more to add value to consoles and expand their life. ROM hacks like newer Super Mario Bros. Wii are so good that they could be their own standalone game, and many other ROM hacks are like adding custom DLC, often adding a lot more customization to different games. These are all tools that were made by the community for the community, and are mostly free, which is why I get angry when people try to paint these guys as bad people who are promoting piracy. These people are taking time out of their days to do free labor for the benefit of others. This time has even amounted to years of work in some cases. Most of these guys aren't even making a single penny from this, and even if they have a Patreon, it is nowhere near the amount they could make if they actually sold their software. The people in these communities are actually some of Nintendo's biggest fans, and unlike Nintendo, actually care for the community, to the point where they are willing to work for free and give back. If you look at this and still say that they are bad people and that Nintendo has a legal right to shut them down, I don't know what to say, because if you were actually a fan of Nintendo, you would love the work that these guys do, and you would wish that Nintendo would work with these people and not against them. This is often why the whole argument of think of the developers kind of falls flat in my opinion. Yes, the developers of games deserve money, but so do the developers of emulators, homebrew, ROM hacks, etc. And they often get paid very little to nothing for what they do. And even then, Nintendo still has a problem even if what you make is very little. It's like complaining that you have a broken leg to someone who has a paralyzed leg. Like, yeah, it sucks that you can't walk for a while, but at least you will get healed, while the paralyzed man can't walk forever. And this argument falls deeper when you realize that Nintendo themselves are hiring emulator developers. It's hard for me to feel sorry about you not getting paid for the small percentage of your games that are pirated when emulator developers who deserve to get paid aren't getting a dime. And wouldn't that statement also go for Nintendo? I mean, if you were a developer and trusted that your games would be safe on the Switch, wouldn't you be pretty furious when you found out how easy it is to hack a Nintendo Switch? Nintendo doesn't get any blame for that? I mean, would you feel comfortable making more games for the Switch in the future? And yes, it isn't directly Nintendo's fault, but if you hired security and they let bad guys in, you probably wouldn't want that same security again now, would you? And you might even want compensation for them not properly doing their job, but that's just me. I'm just putting that out there. I would now like to take a look at Sega, who, unlike Nintendo, has actually had a much more favorable approach to emulation. On Steam, right now, you can purchase the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Classics Collection, which comes with over 50 titles which are emulated on Sega's own emulator. But, if you want, you can also just take the ROMs and play them on other emulators as well. And I believe they are the only developer to officially sell ROMs. And I feel like Nintendo should follow Sega's footsteps. As the famous Gabe Newell saying goes, the easiest way to stop piracy is not by putting anti-piracy technology to work, it's by giving those people a service that's better than what they're receiving from the pirates. All this time and money going to sending lawsuits and cease and desists is only going to lead to more piracy. Except that you won't be able to be in control of everything, and that's okay. Your fans deserve to have the right to actually own their consoles and games. Instead of getting mad at the community for making improvements, find ways to work with them. Make sure that your games are available at a reasonable price instead of deleting them for good. If you decide to stop supporting a console, don't get mad if the community supports it themselves. Give them the tools to support it. Unfortunately, you missed the mark when it came to the Switch, and no amount of lawsuits is going to change that fact nor stop piracy. Accept responsibility for that and do a better job on your next console. If Nintendo actually starts to support the community, then the community will start to support Nintendo back. We will want to purchase Nintendo games, not just because that's the right thing to do, but because we would actually want to support Nintendo. Because all of this fighting against piracy is just going to make more people want to pirate. But that might just be wishful thinking. Anyways, peace.